He ordered the same thing every Tuesday at 6 a.m. sharp: black coffee, scrambled eggs, wheat toast, no butter. The waitress barely looked up anymore, just scribbled the order and walked away. He was just another regular at Murphy's Diner, another old man with nowhere urgent to be. But what she didn't know was that every Tuesday for the past 3 years, he'd been sitting in the exact same booth, watching the same intersection, waiting for someone who would never show up. Until today, when a young Marine walked through that door and recognized the tattoo barely visible under his rolled-up sleeve, a mark that shouldn't exist, from a mission that never officially happened. Welcome to the Human Stories. Before we dive into this powerful tale of loyalty, loss, and unexpected connections, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. These forgotten heroes need our voices. Murphy's Diner hadn't changed since 1987. Red vinyl booths, checkered linoleum floors, and a coffee machine that groaned every time it brewed a fresh pot. It sat on the corner of 5th and Main in Cedar Falls, Iowa, the kind of small town where everyone knew everyone, except they didn't really know anyone at all. At exactly 6 a.m. every Tuesday, the bell above the door would chime, and Frank Morrison would walk in. Same worn leather jacket, same faded jeans, same careful steps that favored his left leg just slightly. He'd nod to Dolores behind the counter, slide into booth number 7 by the window, and order without looking at the menu. "Morning, Frank," Dolores would say, already reaching for the coffee pot. "Morning, doll," he'd reply, settling into the cracked vinyl seat that had molded to his frame over the years. Most folks figured Frank for a retiree. Maybe factory work, maybe construction, something that had left him with the limp and the careful way he moved his shoulders. He was polite, quiet, always left a decent tip. Never caused trouble, never stayed long. Just coffee, eggs, toast, and gone by 6:45. What they didn't see was the way his eyes never stopped moving, the way he positioned himself to watch both the front door and the kitchen entrance, the way his hand always rested near his jacket pocket, fingers loose but ready. And they definitely didn't notice that every Tuesday he spent those 45 minutes staring out the window at the bus stop across the street, watching for someone who would never come. Frank had been keeping this vigil for 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days. Not that anyone was counting. On this particular Tuesday, October 15th, the morning started the same. Frank ordered his usual. Dolores poured his coffee without being asked. The local farmers discussed corn prices at the counter. Everything normal, everything routine. Then at 6:23 a.m., the bell chimed again. The kid who walked in looked like he'd been driving all night. Marine dress blues wrinkled from the car, hair regulation short but mussed, eyes red with exhaustion. He was young, maybe 22, 23, with the kind of rigid posture that comes from months of drill instructors screaming corrections. He slid into the booth behind Frank, ordered coffee, and asked for a phone charger. Dolores disappeared into the back to find one, leaving the diner quiet except for the sizzle of eggs on the grill and the farmer's low conversation. That's when Frank rolled up his sleeves. It was a habit he'd developed over the years. The diner got warm, the coffee made him sweat, and the thick scar tissue on his forearms needed air. He'd done it 1,000 times before, never thinking about what might show. But this time, someone was looking. The young Marine's eyes caught something as Frank reached for his coffee cup, a tattoo mostly hidden under the fabric of his sleeve, but visible now in the fluorescent light. It wasn't much, just a few black lines, a partial symbol, but it was enough. The Marine's coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips. He stared for a long moment, blinking like he was trying to clear his vision. Then, very quietly, he leaned forward. "Excuse me, sir," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "That ink on your arm, is that what I think it is?" Frank froze. In 3 years of Tuesdays, no one had ever noticed, no one had ever asked. He slowly turned to face the young man, And for the first time, someone in Murphy's diner saw Frank Morrison's eyes really focus. "Depends what you think it is," Frank said carefully. The Marine swallowed hard. "Dev Grew, SEAL Team 6. The diner went silent. Even the farmers stopped talking. Frank stared at the kid for a long moment, measuring him. Then he pulled his sleeve down and turned back to his window. "You're mistaken, son." But the Marine wasn't backing down. He'd seen what he'd seen. "Sir, with respect, I know what that tattoo means. My CO served with respect. I know what that tattoo means. My CO served with Devgru in Afghanistan. He's got the same mark." Frank's jaw tightened. "Yours should know better than to talk about things that don't exist." "He didn't talk about it," the Marine said quietly. He showed it to us once, said it represented the men who went places that weren't on any map, did things that weren't in any report." Dolores returned with the phone charger, sensing the tension but not understanding it. She set it down carefully and retreated to the counter, suddenly very interested in wiping down glasses that were already clean. Frank took a long sip of his coffee, eyes still fixed on the bus stop across the street. When he spoke, his voice was different, quieter, heavier. "What's your name, Marine?" "Corporal James Rodriguez, sir. 2nd Battalion, 3rd Marines." "Rodriguez." Frank rolled the name around like he was tasting it. "You got family?" "Yes, sir. Wife and daughter back in Pendleton." Frank nodded slowly. "Good. Hold on to that." He paused, still watching the window. "What brings you to Cedar Falls, Corporal?" Rodriguez hesitated. I'm on my way to a funeral, sir. Lost a friend last month. IED outside Kandahar." "What was his name?" "Tommy Chen. We called him Doc. He was our corpsman." Frank's hand stopped moving toward his coffee cup. For a moment, he didn't breathe. "Tommy Chen," he repeated, voice barely audible. "Yes, sir. Did you know him?" Frank was quiet for so long that Rodriguez thought he wasn't going to answer. The farmers had given up pretending not to listen. Dolores stood frozen behind the counter, coffee pot in hand. Finally, Frank pulled out his wallet. From behind his driver's license, he extracted a small, worn photograph. He set it on the table between them. The photo showed 8 men in desert camouflage, faces painted, weapons ready. They looked young, dangerous, and tired in the way that only comes from weeks in hostile territory. In the center of the group, barely recognizable under the face paint, was a younger Frank Morrison. And kneeling next to him, grinning despite the exhaustion, was a young Navy corpsman with kind eyes and gentle hands. Tommy Chen. Rodriguez stared at the photo, then at Frank, then back at the photo. "That's impossible," he whispered. "Doc never said. He never mentioned." "Doc didn't mention a lot of things," Frank said, carefully placing the photo back in his wallet. "Neither do I. But you knew him. You served with him." Frank finally turned away from the window, meeting Rodriguez's eyes directly for the first time. "I didn't serve with Tommy Chen, son. Tommy Chen saved my life." The story came out slowly, in pieces, like Frank was reassembling it from fragments he'd tried to forget. It was 2019, a black operation in Syria, the kind that doesn't appear in newspapers or military records. 8 men, deep behind enemy lines, extracting a high-value target who had information about planned attacks on American soil. Everything went wrong. Their insertion was compromised. Their extraction point was overrun. Their communications were jammed. For 6 days, they moved through hostile territory with half the Syrian army hunting them and no way to call for help. On the 4th day, Frank took shrapnel from a mortar round. Nothing fatal, but deep enough to cause problems. By the 6th day, infection had set in, and he was slowing the team down. "I told them to leave me," Frank said, staring into his coffee. "Standard protocol, mission first, always mission first." But Tommy Chen, barely 25 years old and technically the lowest-ranked man on the team, refused. While the rest of the team created a diversion, Tommy stayed behind with Frank. For 18 hours, he carried a man 40 pounds heavier than himself through hostile territory. When they ran out of antibiotics, he used honey from abandoned beehives to prevent sepsis. When Frank's fever spiked, Tommy gave him his own water ration. They made it to the extraction point with 30 seconds to spare. Tommy never said a word about it afterward, Frank continued. Never asked for recognition, never wrote it up, just did his job and moved on. That's the kind of man he was. Rodriguez was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was thick. He was the same way with us, always taking care of everyone else first. When he got hit, Rodriguez stopped, unable to finish. Frank reached across the table and placed his hand on the young Marine's shoulder. He didn't suffer, did he? Rodriguez shook his head. It was quick, sir. He was trying to get to one of our guys who was wounded. The IED went off before he could reach him. Frank closed his eyes. Of course he was. They sat in silence for several minutes. Outside, the morning bus pulled up to the stop across the street. A few passengers got off, went about their business. The bus drove away empty. Sir, Rodriguez said finally, can I ask you something? Frank nodded. Every Tuesday for 3 years, you've been watching that bus stop. Were you waiting for Tommy? Frank's smile was sad and small. Tommy used to say that when we got out, when all this was over, he was going to take a bus to the middle of nowhere, find a diner that served real eggs and coffee that didn't taste like mud. Said he'd buy me breakfast and we'd talk about normal things for once. He gestured toward the window. This was the middle of nowhere, and Murphy's serves real eggs. But Tommy never came. No, Frank said quietly. Tommy never came. But I kept waiting anyway, because that's what you do for a friend. You keep the promises even when they can't. Rodriguez wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. The funeral is today, in Sacramento. That's where Tommy's family is. Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled out his phone and made a call. Yeah, it's me, he said when someone answered. I need you to cancel my appointments today. No, everything's fine. I just need to take a trip. Sacramento, I'll explain later. He hung up and looked at Rodriguez. Mind if an old SEAL crashes a Marine's funeral? Rodriguez smiled through his tears. I think Tommy would like that, sir. Frank left money on the table, enough to cover both their meals and a generous tip for Dolores, who was still pretending not to listen. As they stood to leave, Rodriguez stopped. Sir, can I ask you one more thing? Shoot. What did you do? I mean, what was your job before? Frank pulled on his jacket, favoring his left shoulder slightly. I fixed things that were broken, son. And when I couldn't fix them, I made sure they stayed broken. They walked toward the door together. As they reached it, Frank paused and turned back to Dolores. Doll, he called out. Yeah, Frank. I won't be needing my usual table anymore, but keep brewing that coffee strong, okay? It's perfect the way it is. Dolores nodded, not trusting her voice. Frank and Rodriguez stepped out into the morning air. The sun was fully up now, burning off the last of the dawn mist. Across the street, the bus stop sat empty, just a bench and a sign, and nothing more. You know, Rodriguez said as they walked toward their cars. Tommy used to tell us stories sometimes, late at night when we couldn't sleep. He never talked about combat, never talked about the dangerous stuff, just funny stories about the guys he'd served with. There was one about a SEAL who could make coffee out of literally anything. Mud, leaves, old socks if he had to. Frank chuckled. That's not a story, son. That's a survival skill. He said this SEAL saved his life once, but he never gave details. Just said the guy was the toughest man he'd ever met, but also the kindest. Frank stopped walking. Oh, Tommy said that? Yes, sir. Said this SEAL taught him that real strength wasn't about how much you could endure. It was about how much you could endure for someone else. Frank stared at the ground for a moment, then looked up at the sky. Tommy Chen, he said quietly, still teaching lessons. They drove to Sacramento in Frank's truck, a beat-up Ford that had seen better decades but still ran smooth. For the first hour, they barely spoke. Rodriguez dozed against the passenger window while Frank navigated the interstate with the steady concentration of a man used to long drives and quiet roads. When Rodriguez woke up, they were passing through Nevada, the landscape stretching endless and brown in all directions. Sir, he said, Can I ask you something personal? More personal than my service record? Rodriguez smiled. What have you been doing for the past 3 years? I mean, besides waiting at the diner. Frank was quiet for a mile, then two. Finally he spoke. After I got out, I tried a lot of things. Security work, some consulting. Nothing stuck. The problem with our kind of training is that it prepares you for everything except normal life. He adjusted his grip on the steering wheel. 3 years ago, I got a letter from Tommy. First contact we'd had since we were discharged. He was getting married, wanted me to be there. But I was in a bad place then. Drinking too much, sleeping too little. I thought it would be better if I didn't show up. Didn't want to bring any darkness to his big day. Rodriguez waited. I wrote him back, told him I couldn't make it, but I'd take a rain check. Said we'd have that breakfast someday, catch up properly. Then I didn't hear from him for a while, which wasn't unusual. We all learned to go quiet when we needed to. Frank's voice got quieter. 6 months later, I got another letter. This one was from his wife. She said Tommy had been deployed, that he talked about me sometimes. Said I was the one who taught him that courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about doing the right thing even when you were scared. What did you do? Oh, I drove to Cedar Falls that day. Don't even know why I picked that town. Just seemed like the kind of place Tommy would choose small, quiet, good people. I went to Murphy's, ordered breakfast, and waited. For 3 years. For 3 years, every Tuesday, same time, same booth. Kept thinking maybe Tommy would surprise me. Show up with some story about how he'd been traveling, hadn't gotten my messages. We'd laugh about it, order too much food, talk about everything except the war. Rodriguez understood. Every soldier had someone they were waiting for, someone who might walk through the door if they just waited long enough. What will you do now? He asked. Frank considered this. I don't know. Maybe it's time to stop waiting and start living. They arrived in Sacramento just before noon. The funeral was at a small church on the outskirts of town, surrounded by oak trees and filled with Marines, Navy personnel, and civilians who had known Tommy Chen as something other than a warrior. Frank and Rodriguez slipped into the back row just as the service began. Frank kept his head down, not wanting to intrude on the family's grief, but as the stories were shared, stories of Tommy's kindness, his humor, his dedication to helping others, he found himself smiling despite the sadness. This was the man he had known. Not just the skilled corpsman who had saved his life, but the young man who had carried candy in his medical kit for local children, who had learned enough Arabic to tell jokes, who had never met a problem he wouldn't try to solve. After the service, as people gathered in the church hall for food and remembrances, Frank started to leave, but Rodriguez caught his arm. Sir, there's someone I want you to meet. He led Frank across the room to where a young woman sat with a little girl on her lap. The woman had Tommy's kind eyes and gentle smile. Sarah, Rodriguez said quietly, this is Frank Morrison. He served with Tommy. Sarah Chen looked up at Frank with recognition in her eyes. You're the one, she said simply. Frank didn't know how to respond. Tommy told me about you, she continued. Said you were the reason he became a corpsman. Said you showed him that warriors can be healers too. She stood up, still holding her daughter. He was planning to invite you to dinner when he got back from deployment. Said he owed you a proper meal and a long conversation. Frank's voice was rough when he spoke. Ma'am, I'm the one who owed him more than I could ever repay. Sarah smiled through her tears. He wouldn't have seen it that way. Tommy never kept score. She paused, then added, he left something for you. I've been wondering how to get it to you. She disappeared for a moment and returned with an envelope, worn from being carried. Frank's name was written on the front in Tommy's careful handwriting. He wrote this before his last deployment, Sarah said. Told me if anything happened, I should find a way to get it to you. Frank took the letter with hands that weren't quite steady. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a photograph. The photo was from Tommy's wedding, him and Sarah dancing, both of them laughing at something off camera. On the back, Tommy had written, "This is what we were fighting for." The letter was brief. Frank, if you're reading this, I probably won't make it to that breakfast we talked about. But I want you to know that everything good in my life came from the lesson you taught me in Syria, that we save each other not because it's our job, but because it's who we choose to be. Stop waiting for me, old friend. Go live the life we fought to protect. Your brother always, Tommy. Frank read the letter twice, then carefully folded it and put it back in the envelope. Thank you, he said to Sarah. This means more than you know. There's something else, she said. Tommy set up a scholarship fund for children of military families. We're looking for someone to help run it, someone who understands service but also understands healing. Frank looked around the room at the Marines sharing stories, at the civilians learning about a man they'd never fully known, at Rodriguez teaching Sarah's daughter how to fold a paper airplane. I'd be honored, he said. 3 months later, Frank Morrison moved to Sacramento. He sold his house in Cedar Falls, said goodbye to Dolores and Murphy's diner, and stopped waiting for Tuesdays. The Tommy Chen Memorial Scholarship had its first board meeting on a Wednesday. Frank wore a suit, the same one he'd worn to Tommy's funeral, and sat in a conference room with Sarah, several other veterans, and a handful of community leaders. Before we begin, Frank said when it was his turn to speak, I want to tell you about the man this scholarship honors. He pulled out the photograph from Syria, the one he'd carried for years but never shown anyone except Rodriguez. This man saved my life, he said. But more than that, he saved my soul. He taught me that strength without compassion is just violence, that courage without kindness is just recklessness. He looked around the room. Tommy Chen never asked for recognition, never wanted his name on anything, but he believed that every person, every child, deserved a chance to become more than their circumstances would suggest. Sarah wiped her eyes. That sounds like Tommy. So this scholarship isn't about honoring a war hero, Frank continued. It's about honoring a healer, someone who saw brokenness and worked to fix it. The scholarship funded its first recipients that fall. 3 children of deployed soldiers, each receiving enough money to attend college. The scholarship funded its first recipients that fall. 3 children of deployed soldiers, each receiving enough money to attend college. Frank personally delivered the letters, driving hundreds of miles to hand them to families who reminded him why the work mattered. Rodriguez, now stationed at Camp Pendleton, visited when he could. He and Frank would sit in Sarah's backyard, watching her daughter play, talking about everything and nothing. You know, Rodriguez said during one visit, I never asked you what you're going to do with your Tuesdays now. Frank smiled. I'm learning to cook. Turns out making a proper breakfast is harder than it looks. Tommy would have liked that. Yeah, Frank said, watching the little girl chase butterflies in the garden. I think he would have. That night, Frank sat at his kitchen table, writing thank you notes to the scholarship donors. It was quiet work, careful work, but it felt right in a way that nothing had for years. On the refrigerator, held by a magnet shaped like a purple heart, was Tommy's wedding photo. Next to it was a new picture, Frank and Sarah and her daughter at the scholarship ceremony, all of them smiling. At the bottom of the new photo, in Frank's careful handwriting, were the words Tommy had written years ago. This is what we were fighting for. Some men spend their lives waiting for their brothers to come home. The lucky ones learn that home is what you build while you're waiting. Frank Morrison had finally stopped waiting, and in doing so, he'd found exactly what Tommy Chen had always known was worth saving.